Hi there, this is John for killerphp.com, and today what I'm going to be doing is looking at how we can write a controller from scratch as part of an MVC framework. Now, you might have heard this term MVC be thrown around a lot on blogs and on the web, and basically it's a pattern for constructing a web application. And I certainly don't endorse that you roll your own or write your own MVC framework from scratch, but I think that what you'll find in these videos is a really great way of looking at how you can architect a system or a site through a bunch of new features in PHP that came about in 5.1, 5.2, and now in 5.3, and that are going to be part of PHP 6 and a lot of the future PHP frameworks that you'll probably end up using just as a way of speeding up your development. In the last video, we looked at setting up a htaccess file with mod rewrite. And what that means is that if you look at my URL here, you'll see that I've got killer.php, which is going to index.php, right? So that's working. However, if I put in any sort of junk here, you'll see that immediately gets filtered to index.php. It all gets routed to index.php. So for all intents and purposes, you can think of index.php as the entry point, that single one entrance into our application. Now what that means is that we can also do some really neat stuff with URL rewriting. We can rewrite a URL, make it search engine friendly. We can have something like new business software up here, and we can route that to anything. We can render anything from there because we know that PHP at the end of the day is going to pick up new business software, and then it's just a matter of firing off the right bit of code to generate, that template. And this is great if you want to have search engine optimized content. So that's just an aside. But for now, we're going to look at the controller. So if I go back to my index.php file, you can see that I've got these two instances of the user object, and I've got this models group object, and I'm just echoing Emily, which is a user object, and what that's doing is it's firing a toString, which we looked at, and this is all inheriting from model abstract. If this all looks a little foreign to you, just take a look at the video 2 videos ago, or 1 video ago, and I kind of go through the architecture of all of this. Anyways, so in my index.php file, we're just going to leave the models alone for now. We're not going to worry about them anymore. We're just going to kind of delete all this stuff. And we're going to start back from auto-loading classes. So the only difference now is that I can basically route everything that I want to index.php. Now what this means is that I can parse the URL or the URI to figure out what I want to load. And in this case, I'm going to say that the URI is equal to the server variable. This is a global variable that's provided by the PHP parser, request URI. And I'm just going to echo URI. So if I hit save, you'll see that whatever I have in the server variable, whether it's new business software or whether it's just the index, I'm going to have it appear here, which is great. So now we can just create a switch statement that loads the right controller under the right circumstances. So I'm going to start off by writing this out as though it already exists, and then we're going to create the classes and the necessary infrastructure down the line. So I'm going to start off, now that I have the URI, I'm going to do a switch statement and pass the URI into the switch statement. And in the case where it's just a /, or in the case where it's a / and index, we're going to have a variable called controller, which will be new controllers / index controller. Now this class doesn't exist right now, so we need to make sure that that all works. The other thing that I want to do before we get any further along is I want to specify the namespace. So if we can imagine that once we've loaded everything, we've got our auto loading function there. So now I'm going to say use com killer PHP controllers as controllers. And then basically this path will be referenced here. Now, in the case where, let's say we've got something where we've got test, then controller will equal new controllers / test controller. Now, I want all of my controllers to have a function called dispatch. Just like that. So you can imagine for a minute here that basically what I'm saying is that I don't want the individual controllers to be concerned with I don't want my index.php file, this particular variable controller, to be dependent on one instance of that controller. It doesn't matter which instance as long as it has this method called dispatch. Now this is a clear example of when you would want to use an interface. What an interface does is it enforces a certain kind of, it's basically a blueprint for a class. It doesn't implement the details, but it creates an underlying agreement or definition of which functions need to exist in that class. So we're going to look at that in a minute, but let's start with the index controller. So the first thing I need to do is go back to my file system. And in my file system here, you'll see that I have a controllers folder already created, but there's nothing inside it right now. So I'm going to create a new PHP file, set the namespace to com killer PHP controllers, and the class is going to be index controller, and I'm going to create a public function called dispatch, which will accept a URI, and I'm going to save this file in my killer PHP com killer PHP controllers index controller.php file. So here I'm just going to echo I'm dispatching URI. And I'll save that. Let's see what happens. Okay, it's getting mad at me because there's no controller called test controller. So I'm going to do the same kind of thing. And I'll say class test controller. And let's say I'm being a little careless here. And I create a typo and I do dispatch like this. So you can see that there's a typo here. I've got two I's. And I'm dispatching test controller. We're going to see how the interface kind of stops us from making silly mistakes. So I'm going to save this test controller .php in my controllers folder. Everything should be good to go. I've got an error on line 6. Oh, public function dispatch. Call to undefined function. Oh, okay, that's working. Well, okay, let's keep going. All right, I'm dispatching test controller. That's why. Right, I forgot the break statement. Okay. And a switch statement needs to end with break or else it just keeps running, and basically what happened was I defined controller to be index controller and then I defined controller to be test, which is not the desired functionality here. So I want two break statements, and now I'm dispatching. It's now using the index controller. I'm dispatching and then the /, and the / is exactly what we want, and we're using the index controller. Now going back here, let's say I had that unfortunate mistake of putting in that typo there. If I refresh this, I'm not going to see any errors until, of course, I call the dispatch controller and I do /test, and then it'll say call to undefined method com killer PHP controllers test controller dispatch. Now, a smarter way of doing this, and a great way of documenting and defining the architecture of your site, is to implement something called an interface. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a new PHP file, and it's going to be, we're going to define this as an interface controller. We'll just call this iController. And what the interface is going to have, it's going to have a public function called dispatch with the URI. And that's all we need to put in there. So in the controllers folder, I'm going to create this iController.php file. Oh, it's also important to set the namespace. So in this case, it'll be com killer PHP controllers, and I'll hit save. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually tell my index controller to implement iController. And I'm going to tell test controller to implement iController. So now if I refresh this page again, assuming that I don't make any more mistakes. Oh, implements. It'll say class test controller contains one abstract method and must therefore be declared abstract or implement the remaining methods from iController dispatch. So this is a great way of tightening up your application and making sure that all of the relationships or inheritance structures that you're building are properly defined. So then it would be very easy for me to discover that I in fact had a typo there. So there we go. If I go /test, then we get test right here. If we go back here, go back to my index controller. I need implements. Hit enter. I'm dispatching, and then /. So we can see that the index controller and the test controller are both dispatching, but that dispatch method is different depending on the request that's being served up by our application. So that's kind of the first step in setting up our controllers in an MVC structure. The next step is actually using this kind of dynamic method calling for creating different actions inside of our controller. So let's say I want to have an index action and a view user action. We can do all of that inside of our class very easily. And I'll show you that in just a minute. So let's say we have index controller here. And I want to have kind of a welcome page, right? So let's say I have index/welcome. And I want this to work properly. Now it's going to say call to a member function dispatch on a non-object. And it's going to say on line 35 and so on and so forth. Now, I could sit down here and for every single case, I could have case/index and then case/index and then welcome and then so on and so forth. And then we'd have to basically re-implement all of this. Or we can do it a little more dynamically. So let's say instead of having to put in all the different cases that we wanted here, so for example, index and then welcome, we could actually split the URI and then go in and actually use that to determine if, the first part is the controller and then the second part is a particular method in that controller that's dispatching the request, then it would be really easy for us to figure out which class we need to do. We don't necessarily need to know how fine-grained, but we know that if it starts with index, it's the index controller. If it starts with test, it's the test controller. So this is a great way of creating different objects that'll handle different parts of our application. So for here, your first inclination might be to use the split function. And it would be something simple like this, and you would go URI split equals split and then URI. Except in PHP 6 and in PHP 5.3, it's deprecated, which means that they're getting rid of it. And in PHP 6, they're actually going to be fully removing split as a function in PHP. So the alternative is to use a regular expression. A regular expression can be done using preg_split. Now this is a little more complicated, but basically regular expressions are a whole language in and of themselves that can be used for splitting and concatenating and searching strings. So the regular expression that we're going to be using here to split the forward slash looks a little something like this. First we need to escape on both sides, on the outside. And then we're going to put in 2 square brackets, and this is what we're going to be searching for. Now we need to escape the forward slash, and then we need to escape the brackets. So it looks a little strange, but basically this is what we're looking at. Now I'm going to put an exit statement here and a var dump over here of URI split to see what we get. Now the first indice is always empty, and then we've got the second indice, or indice 1, which is index, and then indice 2, which is welcome. So if I put in welcome/hello, then I get a third indice. If I put nothing, I get nothing. If I put test, then I get test. So I think you can see where this is going. Basically, we want to do a switch statement on URI split with the first indice. And if the first indice is nothing or it's index, we want to load the index controller. And if it's anything else, we want to load test. We can even go further, and we can take that indice and we can lowercase it. So this way, our application will work if somebody writes in test all uppercase, or they write index / something something, or what have you. This is a great way of making sure that your URLs are nice and robust. So now that we've set up our dispatching, we can do a bit of work on the index controller. And that's what we're going to be doing in the next video. And we're going to start introducing this idea of callbacks. And this is where things are going to get really interesting. So first we're going to load views into our controller. We're going to finish the MVC model. And then we're going to start introducing anonymous functions, which are coming in PHP 5.3 and are going to be part of PHP 6. Thanks for listening.